Okay, everyone. So I'm going to drop you down to my work area. And again, I'm not able to see the chat function right now because my computer is tilted. So if you have a question at any point, just unmute yourself and talk to me so that I can answer your questions quickly. So I have my plexiglass plate that I used for my dry point. You all received one piece of plexiglass. You can do all of your monotyping on the back side of your plexiglass if you don't want to utilize your engraving kind of working within that middle ground. You can also get plexiglass at many hardware stores for relatively cheap. You don't need a very thick piece of plexiglass at all, so it actually is quite inexpensive. So if you want to work larger or just have the ability to have multiple plates, you can absolutely get multiple pieces of plexiglass for rather inexpensive. Even if you go to perhaps a frame shop or any I know Rhinebeck does framing in town in New Paltz. They may have scraps that they would just recycle. So it might even be worth an ask to see if you can get some plexiglass for free. Those of you that want to kind of start to experiment a bit more. But you can complete this project with just the piece of plexiglass that you received. So, again, monotyping is the creation of these prints via painting and application of ink to the surface of your plate. I'm going to pull a couple of prints, and so I already have some of my paper dampened and kind of waiting in the wings. It's the same process of kind of spraying or soaking it and then leaving it in a paper, in a towel rather, until you're ready to use it, and then wiping off that excess off the surface. So what I have over here is my palette. I have a bunch of ink laid out, and then I have a lot of tools that I can use. I have kind of a bunch of varieties of brushes, but I also have, these are kind of applicators to work with clay. I also have kind of a small like makeup applicator kit. And all of these basically just wipe away or apply ink with different textures and line thicknesses to kind of create variety. So like we were working with Collagraph using a lot of different textures, physical textures, here we're using a lot of different applicators to create different textures. So the first thing I want to kind of introduce you to is the idea of additive monotype. Additive monotype being exactly what you kind of think. It's applying ink directly to plate with a brush or any types of these applicators. Like you saw in a lot of the examples, you have kind of the ability to paint with any number of colors and to work within that a larger palette. Again, we talked about how this ink may have a tendency to dry rather quickly. I know in these previous techniques, we haven't really spent a lot of time here in the inking process where we might run into the problem of having ink dry on us. If you start to work and you're noticing kind of your inks drying up, what you can do and add to this to kind of slow the drying time a bit is to add some oil to it. I have plate oil. Some of you who are painters or maybe have some painting materials have linseed oil. You can use that in a pinch. For those of you that maybe don't have some of that on hand, you can use a neutral cooking oil like vegetable or canola oils. We're going to use this sparingly because we don't want too much of this oil to kind of override the pigment and other materials in the ink and kind of then leach out into our paper. But this oil is going to allow us a little bit more flexibility in drying. I have very little ink right here right now, so I'm going to add maybe just a dot. Actually, I'm just going to smear it on with my finger. Like that's probably the equivalent of maybe a large pinhead, smaller than a pea-sized. A little goes a long way, and I'm also erring on the side of not overriding my ink with oil. I would recommend with all of you to pull a test monotype without manipulating your ink at all first, just to see if you kind of work within the confines of the drying time safely. Because if you do, then you don't need to modify your ink at all. And that just saves you a step, and you don't run the risk of oiling up your paper in the process. So now that I have a colored ink and kind of a smaller palette being made, I'm going to apply ink again directly onto the back side of my dry point. I don't want to apply to the front side of my dry point right now and just creating a individual monotype, because I don't want ink to catch in the lines that I have for my dry point if I'm not going to be using it. If you have a reference drawing or say a photograph, again, like your dry point, it's very easy to stick something right underneath your piece of plexiglass so that you can kind of work in registration. I'm just going to freehand it for the sake of the demo, but you do have the ability to kind of work with some pre-made materials to help you with what you're drawing. I'm just going to go abstract for the sake of this demo. Now, some of you may have found, especially with within your relief and collagraphs, that layering up a lot of ink doesn't necessarily give you a clean, crisp print. And that's going to be just as true for these prints as well. Because you're working on the flat surface of the plexiglass, you're not kind of pushing anything into any reservoirs or things like that. So you don't need a lot of ink, especially with a dampened piece of paper. So right now, it's going to be maybe a little bit difficult to see, but I have some ink built up a little bit here. You can kind of see where those most saturated areas are. And my worry with those is that I have a little bit too much ink there, and it might kind of spread out and kind of push and distort in those areas, kind of losing some of that detail of that brushwork. Where here, it's very, very thin, and while it's still going to transfer with enough saturation, I'm not going to lose those brush strokes in the process. So it's a little bit of a game with learning how much ink you should apply so that you get your details while not losing the image by not having enough ink in the process. You can also, again, apply ink using makeup applicators or any number of tools. I particularly like using a variety of brushes, but these applicators can give you some really intriguing textures to work with. Now, one thing you can also do is work with your brayer as well. So if you want to have kind of larger areas of flat kind of plain surfaces, you can apply, let's not use just straight blue. You can apply using your brayer directly onto the surface of your plate. Again, same texture that you wanted in your relief prints, that kind of really light orange peel texture. And what I'm going to do is just roll it right along the edges here. So you can get a really wide variety of planes of color. So these won't read with any kind of brush texture, which is actually quite nice. Do this final chord. Now, I have obviously this whole plate being additive right now. On the opposite side, we also have the ability for reductive printmaking, or reductive monotype within this. Meaning instead of applying ink to the surface, we want to take some ink away so that we're exposing more of the paper tone in our prints. And to do that, it's literally just the reverse. So I'm going to do that in these corners here where I've applied ink now, but I want some more kind of visual line work in these areas. You can take that away using a Q-tip or paper towel. I like to use the back sides of paintbrushes or any of my applicators because I can actually draw really fine line work within these areas of ink. And so when this prints, I have the background being color, but the line work that I'm making being the light of the paper. So almost a negative of what you would expect from a traditional image. And I might be able to you might be able to see it actually against my apron. So let me just finish these weird marks. If you couldn't tell from the previous demos, the goal of these is not for me to create masterpieces by any means. It's to show you these techniques in a way that's fast enough so that we're not here all day, but also successfully. So here you can see now in printing this where I've drawn these kind of squiggled lines will show up as the light of the paper with then the background being this blue. So here we have then the additive, but then also the reductive in that we've taken that ink away in those areas. Here too, we can work with an applicator and let me kind of pull this closer and literally wipe away some of the materials that we worked with earlier and kind of scoop that ink up. All of that being then the reductive of this process. And a quite simple process at that. So I've already noticed that some of this ink on my plate is starting to dry. So we've been working for maybe 15 minutes on this. So keep that in mind. You'll have the benefit of the dampened paper to kind of reactivate some of this. So we'll see how this kind of transfers in the process as well. So I'm going to pull one of my dampened sheets out. Again, I'm going to wipe the residual water off the surface of the paper so that there's nothing shiny and kind of glistening about the paper when I go to lay it down on my plate. Where's my registration sheet? I'm going to pull out an additional registration sheet, lay that underneath my plate. I'm going to do a weighted top and side. And then I'm going to lay my dampened piece of paper down. And much like all of the other techniques that we've been doing, you want to lay your piece of parchment paper over the top. And you can use a spoon or a flat surface like a Baron for this. Unlike with the dry point, because we wanted to push that paper into those recesses, we just want contact with the ink that we've painted. And that's achievable with kind of a more general pressure. So I'm going to apply that over the surface of my plate, making sure I get all the way to the edge. I do tend to like to work in multiple directions for any material, any print like this, that I really want to make sure I get the whole of what I've applied. And I have a decent edge to my plate mark. What I can do too is take a peek at what's transferred. Ooh, nice. And then here we can see now that translation of all of that additive ink, but then also the reductive parts on the corners of the plate, as well as some that kind of smushed here in the middle. You can see here where I've applied ink a little thickly, that it kind of smears out and distorts. So you want to err on that side of having that nice balance of ink that can sometimes mean a little less. Here you can see that all of my brush strokes really remained true, but like I had assumed earlier, up here in this spot here and in some of the black, I applied just too much ink, and it pressed outwards when I was getting ready and printing this. What we have on the plate now, if we were in the studio, we could print as a ghost print. Because we're working with ink that dries rather quickly, this I would deem potentially not as successful as a print, just based on not having a lot here, but also knowing that this ink is going to dry. You are more than welcome to experiment with your ghost prints, but just be aware that not much of this ink might transfer because of this drying time. Like we've been cleaning our plates before with, if we're ready to then pull another monotype, simply mist your plate with water and wipe it off with a rag, and then you're ready to apply another round of ink onto the surface of your plate. So that right now is additive and reductive. I think they're relatively self-explanatory, but can be used in tandem, can also be used by themselves. Does anyone have questions on additive and reductive right now? Beautiful. Okay, next I want to show you trace monotype. And this type of monotype you're going to do with a piece of dry print paper. What you're doing is essentially creating two prints with one. You're creating a positive and a negative. And you start this by inking up your entire plate with your brayer. Let's use, what color do I want to use? Let's make a green. Purple. Let's go purple. So you want to apply and mix the ink up just like you did for your relief prints. And we want to ink the whole of the plate, again, just like we would if we were inking this up like your relief print, giving yourself that kind of orange peel texture. I'm using the spongier of the two brayers for this because I'm not worried about ink falling into any crevices. I want to apply a nice smooth area of ink. All right, so here again, working with the back of my dry point plate, I'm going to apply this ink over the whole back of my plate. What's nice about this spongy brayer as well, that some of you really kind of discovered with the relief prints, is that it doesn't leave the kind of brayer marks as visibly as that kind of firmer brayer does. What's also nice about the plexiglass versus the linoleum is that you can delicately hold your piece of plexiglass up to the light and really see if there are any areas that you've not printed or not inked up rather with enough ink so that you don't run into kind of areas that have lighter spots than you intended. So now that I have this plate fully inked up, what I'm going to do is take my piece of dry printed paper and lay it directly over my plate right now. But I'm not going to touch it because whatever I want transferred onto the plate, I'm going to draw. So here with a pencil, what I can do is I can take a piece of newsprint or an additional piece of paper, or perhaps you have a sketch already drawn out that you can then, without kind of putting your hands down onto the print itself, simply trace. And so the pressure of your pencil is going to transfer the ink from the plate onto this dry piece of paper. So when I'm resting my hands down, I'm not touching the plate itself. And now I'm just going to draw along the surface of the plate. I'm drawing on this piece of parchment paper because I don't want to have these pencil marks directly onto my plate. And I'm using a dry piece of paper as opposed to a wet paper because this dry paper isn't going to transfer the ink as readily as that wet piece of paper does, kind of like we've found already this in these previous processes. So I'm using that to the advantage this time, so it's not going to transfer ink as readily in areas that I don't want it to fall in the first place. So here, this is of course a very rapid trace monotype. All right, so what I've done is I've drawn, you can't really see on the parchment paper, I've drawn directly onto the plate, and so now when I lift this, I should have then that image transferred with the ink from my plate, which I do. Excellent. So here then you can see then that transfer. What's actually kind of nice about this, and I'll post a picture of this so that you can really see the details, is that you get a little bit of like a crayon granular texture, a little bit of noise from the fibers of the paper catching the ink from your plate. Again, wet paper will do more of that, but this dry paper only did it in a few spots, and especially in the areas where I've condensed more of my drawn lines. Now, the best part of this is that now not only do I have this drawn kind of crayon-inspired print, I also now have the negative of that on my plate still. So I can have kind of the positive and negative. I could also work into this right now, maybe with some more reductive monotype if I wanted to, but I'm just going to print this as an exact negative of the print I just pulled so that you can see the kind of partnership that this makes. When you're printing this version of it, use damp paper because you want to pull as much of this ink off now as possible. Dry for the initial trace monotype, wet for then, or dampened rather, for then the transfer of the negative. Let me pull that sheet of paper. So now using the same registration system we've been using. Lay that down. Take my parchment again. And then press firmly to get all of that ink to transfer onto your paper this time. Again, you can use a spoon for this. Really anything that you used for printing your relief prints, you can use for this process as well. So whatever you found most successful in your relief printing, you can use here for your monotypes. So now, when we lift this up, we now have then the negative of that initial print. So let me pull that first one over. So here then you have that kind of diptych almost on the one image. You do not need to print the ghosted negative to work with trace monotype. If you just want to create prints like this, you're more than welcome to. It isn't an obligation to then print what's left on your plate. If you want to just kind of pull some line work and drawing this way. Questions on the trace monotype and the printing then of the residual ink?
I have a question.
Yes.
In this case, we need to show the use of the dry point and the monotype techniques. We can combine them, etc. So it doesn't need to look like a series?
Nope.
Okay.
Nope. The kind of inherent quality of monotype is that they are individuals. And so while you can create a series that are maybe tied under the same kind of content umbrella, I have no problem with you making 6 prints that are just wildly different. That means, I guess, a little bit larger of a work statement so that you can explain their differences. But they don't need to be tethered at all if you want to work with 6 very individual images. Does that answer your question, Maria Elena?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Great. All right. So the last thing I want to introduce here is also the use of stencils, because I think that they're really particularly fun to utilize and work great with monotype. So I'm going to clean my plate off. I do have a bit of residual ink, but it's so thin of an application, it's going to dry within moments. And so I'm just going to, again, clean it off with a mist of water. Again, you can run this under a sink as well. And so for the use of stencils, it's something you want to create beforehand. You can use, really simply, if you wanted to use just newsprint or scrap pieces of paper. You can also use Duralar or Mylar, acetates, anything that's kind of plastic based in a thin film. I like using those a little bit because they're reusable. You can easily just clean the ink off and continually use them in repeated prints. These paper stencils, while they're quick and perhaps even free if you have a whole bunch of scrap, they tend to deteriorate or only be useful once or twice. So that's kind of up to you. I'm just going to create a couple of little leaf shapes. That tends to be my go-to in demonstrations, are just leaves. We'll make 3. So stencils can also be utilized at the same time as any of these other monotype techniques. So I'm going to just do a little bit of additive inking so that we have some color for this these stencils to work with. I'm just going to use my palette knife kind of outright. And like some of my examples showed you, you can work very representationally. I'm working rapidly here, so I tend to go a little bit more loosely abstract when I'm working like this. But work within your interests and what visuals you enjoy and like to see. I'll do a little bit more of the reductive too, so we can have another example of that. So now we have kind of a really quick and rapid additive and reductive print. We can print this outright, but what I'm going to do now is kind of load these stencils onto the surface, and this is going to give us kind of two opportunities for the print. We'll lay that there. First, what these stencils are going to do is completely block that ink from transferring onto my paper. So I'm going to have rather large white spaces within this print where these three stencils are. So printing these the exact same way using dampened paper. So lay my paper down. So here now what we're going to see is, again, the original print, but then the three kind of open areas where my stencil was. I printed this rather rapidly. I should have pushed a little with more force on my print. But now here on my plate, I have kind of that ghosted image, but in flipping over these stencils, what I'm going to get is kind of the protected ink that these stencils have on them now. And I can flip these over and then create a completely different print, but kind of a companion to what I just printed, because it's the ghost image of the first plate, but with these slight transitions of these original stencils being flipped over. So here I can now reprint this and then get some even more drastic differences. Again, with dampened paper, and I'm not applying any more ink to this, so this is a true ghost print with then, I guess, the subtle addition of these stencils being flipped over and exposing that fresh ink. I'll print this one using the spoon this time. I have to be a little bit more precise with my printing here because the spoon has that kind of finer point of pressure. And unlike the Baron, which is a bit more broad, so I know I caught everything with the Baron, where here I want to make sure I do that same crisscrossing, doing all these directions to make sure I catch every last bit of ink in the process. And I'll work the final direction here. There we go. Perfect. So here you can see then that ghost image got transferred, but then here that newsprint that was holding that ink now is translated into a distinguishable leaf, here being those protected areas from that initial print as well. Let me show you both of these now side by side. So much like the trace monotype with its companion, here too with the stencils, you get two prints that are similar but distinguishable in their own rights, but definitely are tethered to one another. Now, I don't think I need to actually demonstrate how to apply Monotype onto the surface of your dry points, but I'll describe it. So basically, like our demonstration last week, you apply ink to the surface of your dry point, wipe off the surface so that just that ink sits in your line work, and then you apply your Monotype textures directly onto then that dry pointed surface, so that when you print, you get the line work that you have embedded ink into, and then also any additional monotyped ink on that surface, all printed in one go. You have to work a little bit on the faster side with that because you don't want the ink to dry in your line work before you get the chance to print it. But you can also, like some of you had done for your previous projects, kind of print multiple times. So wait until your dry point is dry and then maybe print a monotype on the surface again, and kind of reprint these and use multiple plates as kind of your ability to layer as well. Does anyone have any questions about the techniques that we did today? We have additive and reductive. We have trace monotypes. And then we have here additive and reductive, but with the use of stencils. Anything?
How many prints do we need?
I'm asking for 6 in this project. And the reason I'm asking for 2 less than what were in the previous ones is because the engraving of your dry point is going to take some time. And the inking of a dry point takes some time. So I didn't want to potentially overburden you with too many prints given the amount of time that we have, because this is a shortened semester. You're more than welcome to print as many as you want. But like in this demo right now, which was 40 minutes, I was able to print 5 monotypes. They are not necessarily at the caliber that I would like to have in my body of work, but it's definitely a doable amount of prints to really take some time to develop your dry point and to develop your imagery for what you want to kind of introduce as monotypes. All right, I'm going to stop the recording now.